Right. I think let's kick off if the CYBER1 Solutions team is happy for us to do so. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar this morning. My name is MacRoberts. I'm a partner with Clyde & Co. in Johannesburg. Clyde & Co. is a law firm, and we specialize in risk advisory services and insurance-related advice. And I'm a member of the firm's global CYBER1 team. So the logo that you see over my shoulder is our CYBER1 offering, which is cyber risk focused, not to be confused with CYBER1 Solutions. So you're seeing a lot of ones on the page. We're joined by my very good friend from CYBER1 Solutions, a tech-focused security solutions business, also in Johannesburg, Edison, Mazibuko. And today we're going to be taking you through some practical insights around dealing with cybersecurity awareness and a preview of the first to market workshop, which we have developed in conjunction with our friends at CYBER1 Solutions, which is around ransomware readiness and specifically strategies for C-level executives and senior decision makers based on the practical experience that we have developed as specialists in dealing with cybercrime in South Africa. So just to take you through a couple of the points that we're going to be walking through today in previewing the workshop. We're going to take you through an overview of the current cyber threat landscape in South Africa. And Edison is going to tell you a little bit about some of the stats that have emerged from a research report which Clyde & Co. published earlier this year. Clyde & Co. has a global cybersecurity team, the largest of which is our colleagues in Australia, where they have over 100 professionals who deal with cybersecurity incidents. And the number of incidents that they deal with has enabled them to publish some really interesting data around what is going on in cybercrime globally. And a couple of the figures that Edison is going to take you through will show you some really interesting stats in terms of what is to come in South Africa. You may ask yourself, why is Australian research relevant to me in South Africa? And the answer to that is quite simple. Australia has set itself the ambitious goal of becoming the most cyber secure nation in the world by 2030. And it has pumped a huge amount of resources in at the government and state levels towards combating cybercrime, which means that it is probably the most robust jurisdiction in the world at the moment in terms of tracking cybercrime incidents, dealing with them from end to end. And so the experience that we as a team have built up over there is tremendously useful in terms of understanding where things may be headed in South Africa over the next few years. But before we get into all that, I just wanted to tell you about how we're going to approach the day. You may be seeing as we speak, there will be a couple of poll questions that pop up, and I would encourage you to answer those questions. We're not keeping track of the answers. They will be kept confidential. They're not going to be shared amongst all of the participants. But in terms of engagement with you, it's just useful to understand what your experience of cybercrime has been. And at the end, we will keep a bit of time back for a Q&A so that you can ask us any questions that you may have following our discussion today. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat as we go along, and we will either deal with them as we're speaking or in the Q&A time at the end. And then lastly, for those of you who have existing relationships, either with Clyde & Co. or with the team at CYBER1 Solutions, you'll be hearing from us after the workshop, just with some of the materials that we've discussed today and a couple of takeaways. And if you do have any questions which you'd like us to deal with, please feel free to reach out to us after the workshop. Well, with that all said, let's jump right in. And Edison, I'm going to hand over you to take us through what the ransomware threat landscape looks like at the moment.
Thank you so much, Chris, and good morning, everybody. Do you lock your doors at night? Of course you do. It's the most common sense thing to do to protect your home and your valuables. But what if I told you the most dangerous thieves today don't need to pick locks or break through windows? They don't even need to leave their own homes. Welcome to the world of ransomware, where a single click can let cyber criminals into your business's most secure vaults. Can we kick to the first slide, please, Chris? Thank you. What is ransomware? Ransomware is a type of malicious software that encrypts your data, effectively taking it hostage. In some cases, these criminals also steal your data and threaten to leak it if you don't pay up. What's particularly frightening is that ransomware has become a global cybercrime industry. It's driven by highly organized groups, often operating in rogue states such as your Iran, North Korea, and even Russia. Let's break it down even further. Ransomware is like a digital version of a kidnapping. Only instead of people, it takes your data hostage. And the villains, they could be anywhere in the world, hiding behind layers and layers of anonymity, demanding ransom payments in cryptocurrency to release your precious files. You're probably sitting there and asking yourself, but what does this really mean for my business? First, financial devastation can be overwhelming. Ransomware losses aren't just the paying of the ransom itself, though that's bad. It's also about the cost of restoring your data, informing your customers and regulators, and the impact, obviously, to your precious reputation. Interestingly, while ransomware attack frequently has decreased, the severity of these attacks has gone up. And perhaps as a sign of hope, the willingness to pay a ransom has dropped significantly from 85% in 2019 to about 29% in 2023. Yet, only 15 to 25% of SMEs currently have cyber insurance, which could be a critical lifeline in such events. And here's the worrying trend. Ransomware is evolving. We're seeing an increase in data theft extortion events, where cyber criminals don't just encrypt your data, they steal it and threaten to leak it if their demands aren't met. This tactic has become the most prevalent form of what we call double extortion. And it's seen in 44% of all ransomware incidents. If there's more ways criminals can make money, you know they'll take it. And despite the record low ransomware payment rates, we're witnessing the return of big game hunting, where large, well-established companies are targeted. The average ransom demands are increasing year after year. And new threats continue to emerge as threat actors such as Lockbit and Black Hat, which are the most popularly known ones, proliferate through the ransomware as a service business model. Yeah, you heard me correctly. It is a whole business model. But it's not just direct attacks that businesses need to worry about. Third-party breaches are becoming the new ransomware. This is where the risk now sits. Approximately about 43% of all third-party breaches stem from managed service provider compromise incidents. Without the skill internally, many organizations are reaching out for help for a lot of these MSSPs or MSPs even. These MSPs are often the weak link in the supply chain because they store and have privileged network access to huge amounts of your sensitive data and from multiple entities. This makes them a prime target for ransomware attacks, which provide a highly efficient avenue for threat actors to monetize data threats. The cost of third-party breaches is approximately 11% more than a general data breach, making preparation and strong cybersecurity practices absolutely essential. And ransomware doesn't impact all sectors equally. Some industries are more vulnerable than others, as you'll see in the next slide. Across the board, sectors such as your health services, professional services, and financial services, and real estate and constructions are the most impacted by cyber incidents. Take the recent healthcare incident that we all know about. It's been all over the news. The ransomware attacked encrypted critical patient and treatment data, causing widespread disruption. As you can see from the data sectors like education and financial services, these are heavily targeted, which underlines the broad reach and devastation of ransomware. So, what can businesses do? While paying the ransom might seem like a quick fix, it is not the solution. Instead, companies need to focus on prevention, regular backups that you test, employee security training, that's become very key, and investing in robust cybersecurity measures. In the world of ransomware, the best defense is a good offense, as we often say. Organizations should enhance contractual protections, improve vendor data handling practices, and align your security controls. Agree on incident response protocols, and if you have the budget, get yourself some of that cyber insurance. Remember this: ransomware is like a bad sequel in a never-ending movie franchise. Each new version is scarier than the last. But with the right protections, you can avoid being the next box office disaster. So next time you hear about ransomware, don't just think of it as another cybersecurity buzzword. Think of it as a plot twist in your business's story that you never want to see. Stay vigilant, stay prepared, and keep your data safe from digital robbers lurking in the shadows. Chris, back to you.
Thanks, Edison. Well, you've painted the picture very well. Not only are you good looking, but listening to you talk about it is a little bit like listening to the guy on e-movies talking about Friday Action Night, previewing what's going to happen.
My next job loading.
Before I jump in with some of the legal stuff, you'll see that we've just popped a poll question up, and it would be really interesting to see your responses. So the first question is, do you provide ransomware and cybercrime training to your decision makers and board members regarding cybersecurity incidents? In other words, do you train your board members, your senior decision makers, around dealing with cyber incidents? It's an interesting question, and we'll come back to that a little bit later, because what we're talking about today is how to join up the technical kind of skill sets, which Edison and his team have, with the legal considerations that come with dealing with the crisis that a cyber incident prevents. So I'm going to just take you through a couple of the interesting features that we have seen at Clyde & Co. in dealing with dozens of cyber incidents in South Africa. So when we talk about South Africa's cyberscape, there are a couple of interesting features. The first is that South Africa is clearly a test bed for cybercrime. We think that the reason for that is that South Africa has a pretty robust and sophisticated corporate sector. Most of you will be employed in companies which have good cybersecurity protections. You probably have regular training. You have pretty good technical security measures. And what that means is that South Africa actually presents attractive targets which can be used as test targets by international cybercrime groups. And we think, at least at Clyde & Co., we think that the reason for that is linked to point 4 on the slide, that we have at the moment a relatively weak law enforcement environment. So what that means is that cyber criminals can try out new attack techniques and vectors with relative impunity in South Africa. And we have certainly seen that in some of the incidents that we've dealt with in the banking and financial services sectors, and especially in the healthcare sector. Edison mentioned the case study a couple of slides back, and I thought it might be useful just to take you back to that and explain what we mean when we talk about the impact of that attack on that particular victim. You will see from the pinwheel on this slide that there is a very wide array of victim targets across various sectors, and this is based on a sample set of over 100 incidents which we encountered in the Australian market through January 22 to the end of March 2023, and this is very representative of the kind of incidents and the spread of incidents that we see in South Africa. The incident which is referenced on this slide affected a listed South African healthcare provider. Some of you may have read about it in the media, but it was a ransomware attack which was indiscriminate in the sense that it was designed to simply encrypt data for purposes of a quick extortion demand. The impacted data proved to be particularly sensitive because it included treatment plans for patients who were critically ill. And without those treatment plans being accessible, the patient's health could deteriorate even further, or in the worst cases, could prove fatal. So there was clearly a massive urgent imperative for the affected company to resolve the situation, and that prompted them to engage with the threat actors. Threat actors is the sexy term that we use for hackers or perpetrators of cybercrime. And they had to go through a negotiation process in an effort to get that data back. Fortunately, it ended with a very good outcome in that we were able to resolve the incident with a successful negotiation. But this is a great example of one of those situations where, even though the company had a policy against paying ransom, was very reluctant to give in to the extortion demand that it had received, it really had no choice because of the severity of the data that was at risk. So as we go through, and in a couple of moments' time, I will talk you through some of the management considerations that come with deciding whether to engage with threat actors in that kind of situation. A couple of the other trends that we see is that generally across the board in South Africa, companies have a fairly vulnerable security posture. That may not be the case at the top end of the market, where we have larger listed companies and big corporates which can pump resources into cybersecurity and have very strong relationships with outsourced vendors and MSPs, people like CYBER1 Solutions who can help you with ensuring that you have a robust security posture. But generally, the rump of cybercrime, the majority that we see affecting our clients and various victims, is at the mid-market level, where companies are hit every day by business email compromise, by phishing attacks, by fraudulent fund payment type fraud. And that is probably where the pain is felt the worst at the moment in our market. So although the focus of today's discussion is around ransomware, cybercrime comes in many forms, and ransomware is probably the one that grabs headlines the most. But at the moment, we probably see most activity around email interception and those kind of frauds which prey on vulnerabilities within organizations, and particularly on human error and employee error, which enables those kind of frauds to take place. And lastly, the good news is that there is a growing cyber insurance market in South Africa. So many of you may already have cyber insurance policies in place within your companies. You may have dealt with cyber insurers, but the good news is that cyber insurance exists to try and remedy and mitigate some of these risks. And much of the work that we do at Clyde & Co. is on behalf of cyber insurers to try and help deal with these situations. And certainly with insurance, the view is that all ships rise with the tide. So the more companies that have insurance, the harder it is to be breached and ultimately to give in to the demands that you receive. Might be useful just to talk about, when one is dealing with an incident, what does a capable incident response team look like? Because some of you may have been through cyber incidents yourself. You may have seen how this works, but it's difficult in a crisis to think about all the role players who may need to be involved. The role that we play at Clyde & Co. Is principally in coordinating incident response and making sure that, as far as possible, we can provide legal protection and legal privilege where it applies to the kind of decisions that need to be taken by management teams in dealing with cybersecurity crises. So we tend to put together a multidisciplinary team, starting with breach counsel, which is the role that we occupy, where we act as the coordinator, the incident response manager in dealing with an incident. We provide legal advice around regulatory and notification obligations. We look at what is required in terms of POPI and the Cybercrimes Act, reporting to law enforcement, and making sure that management is appropriately advised on how to take those key decisions. Secondly, and probably the second most important service provider in all of this, is your technical and forensics teams. There may be more than one. Usually you will have an outsourced specialist who will work with your internal IT teams, and their job is to get to the heart of how the breach occurred, what can be done to stop it and prevent further damage, and then in the longer term to understand what data has been impacted and who has been affected by a breach. So the forensic team plays a hugely important role in understanding the root cause analysis and in putting in place remediation measures to contain the fallout of an incident and to make sure that it can't continue or be repeated. And again, your team at CYBER1 Solutions can provide a lot of advice around best practice for security safeguards, which will complement the work that is done by digital forensic specialists. The third aspect to a multidisciplinary team is communications. It may be important, particularly in a matter that has become of public interest or where there is media scrutiny, to ensure that there is proper PR and crisis communications being provided. So it may be necessary to bring in reputation management specialists who can assist in crafting messaging to deal with a crisis, and importantly, to try and take a lot of the noise out of what is happening, because your incident response team wants to be focusing on dealing with the incident. It's a little bit like the analogy of a fire. You want to make sure that the fire is being contained and treated with the appropriate chemicals to put it out. You don't want to be fighting fires on multiple fronts. And the PR team plays a huge role in making sure that your messaging and your proactive communications with affected parties, with regulators, with customers are clear, consistent, and also de-risked from a legal standpoint. So we as the lawyers work very closely with the PR teams to make sure that we're saying the right kind of things. Notification services may be relevant in certain situations. In the last few years in South Africa, there have been a couple of well-known credit bureau breaches. And as a result of those breaches, those entities have had to put in place credit monitoring services. So what you can do is, if you know that there is a particular population of data subjects who have been affected by a breach, credit notification or monitoring services will assist in monitoring their profiles for any unusual activity. And that's an important tool to try and prevent identity theft or further types of fraud. And then lastly, if you are an insured client with a cyber insurer, the insurance broker will play an important role. Firstly, in providing guidance as to what the policy can do, what it will cover, and also making sure that the insurance broker liaises with the cyber insurer around policy coverage and to ensure that decisions are taken in the right kind of timeframes. So from a practical perspective, there's a lot to think about, particularly for boards that are dealing with cyber incidents. But I just wanted to highlight a few of the legal actions that come and that kind of come across the boardroom table when one is working through an incident. And these will generally play out over the course of several weeks once an incident has arisen. The first is that one needs to look at regulatory and law enforcement reporting. I've already touched on that, but all of those little acronyms that you see there are the names of acts and they need to be complied with. And there may be sector-specific laws and regulations that apply to your company. The second, and this is probably the most difficult from a strategic standpoint, is what to do with threat actor negotiation. So do you take a decision to engage with threat actors? Is there a strategic reason why you would want to be buying time in a negotiation? Are you in a situation like the healthcare provider that we mentioned, where you really don't have a choice but to negotiate? Or do you want to better understand the kind of data that has been impacted, so that even if you have no intention of paying the criminals, you might want to engage or pretend to negotiate with them to get a better understanding of what is truly at risk? Because in these situations, particularly with ransomware, it's a bit like a big game of poker. You need to work out to what extent the criminals are bluffing, and they hold most of the cards. They will know more about what they have done than you do, and so your technical teams are playing catch up. And if you can negotiate with them in a way that gets you a bit more information or proof of life samples of data, it will help in how decisions need to be made. You need to look at contractual obligations. Particularly, this is a job for legal teams in companies which deal with incidents. Many contracts with customers, with key suppliers, or other service providers contain specific obligations around notification of a data breach. So you might need to look at how you need to comply with those obligations to tell customers that something has happened. And then in the longer term, it's usually important to do a data impact review. So once you know what kind of data has been affected, you need to actually look at it to identify the extent to which personal information has been impacted, and do you need to look at notifying regulators in any other markets or jurisdictions to ensure that you're not falling foul of any requirements. We've already touched on communications, so I'm not going to labor that point, but it's important not only to be communicating externally, but also to be keeping your internal communications consistent, so that employees are not speculating, so that they understand what has happened if they come into work and their computer doesn't turn on, and so that you are reducing unnecessary speculation, fear-mongering, which could amplify a sense of crisis. For directors and officers, there is a particularly important point which deals with legality. If you are thinking about making a ransom payment, there is a very important process that needs to be worked through, which touches on sanctions risk, on anti-money laundering, and on making sure that any directors or decision makers who are taking a decision potentially to pay a ransom are not inadvertently falling foul of the law. And much of what we do is providing legal advice around that. And then, of course, one might need to look at other legal obligations specific to your sector. So if you work, for example, in the banking sector, you will very likely be regulated and will need to make specific disclosures beyond what an ordinary company would do. And that will apply to any number of different industries. So you'll get the sense that from all of these points, there are a lot of different legal considerations that need to be addressed. I'd like to talk a little bit more about threat actor engagement, but before I do, we've got a second poll question. And the question is, do you feel confident in your organization's ability to recover from a ransomware attack? It's a pretty loaded question because, as you would see from what we're talking about, there are any number of ways in which a ransomware attack can affect a business, and typically it takes weeks or even months to recover. But it would be interesting to know how confident you feel about your own organization's protocols, and we'll come back to those answers at the end of the session. So let's talk about threat actor engagement. And based on our experience in dealing with a number of incidents where there have been different reasons to engage with threat actors, it's helpful to share with you some of the insights that we've learned from those negotiations. The first is that for any decision maker, it's important to weigh up the pros and cons of engaging. You may take a firm, kind of almost a moralistic view that you will not engage with threat actors. You will not negotiate with terrorists. You will not give criminals the satisfaction of knowing that they've got to you. But for all of the reasons that I just mentioned, there might be good strategic reasons to enter into some negotiation. It should always be done in a very controlled way, and we would certainly say that you should always get specialist advice from an outside source before you attempt to engage with threat actors. We have seen incidents go very badly wrong, where individuals within companies have decided to reach out themselves in an attempt to resolve a situation, and that almost always sets a clock or a countdown timer ticking on a negotiation, which then makes it much more difficult to resolve the situation. So there's a lot of thought that needs to go into how one structures a threat actor engagement. You don't know who you're going to be negotiating with. Typically, negotiations take place over a kind of chat or text platform. Occasionally, we've seen incidents where threat actors telephonically contact individuals in management to make threats. In a recent incident, we saw a negotiation that proceeded in the usual way for a while, where messages were exchanged. And once the threat actors felt that they were not being prioritized, that they were being ignored, shut down, they actually started phoning the CFO of the victim company to issue further threats. So those kind of contacts can come in different ways, and it's not predictable. It's really important to understand that threat actors will look to escalate a situation as quickly as possible. There's a lot of game theory that goes into all of this, but they will look to exert as much pressure as they can. They will create a sense of urgency. They will threaten to publish or destroy data that they may have stolen. They may even threaten to contact your employees or customers. And we've seen all of those things happen in different incidents. So it's important to understand what they might do, but also one needs to remember that they are operating these kind of criminal enterprises as a business, and their objective is to get paid. And so the longer they keep negotiating with you, the higher they think their chances are of getting paid. So there is leverage that can be applied on both sides of that equation. It's really important and difficult in these situations to remove emotion from decisions, to try and take a step back and ideally have a negotiator who is independent from the company and is able to keep a close record of negotiations, which can then be reported back to management. That helps both in placing some distance between the demands that are being made and decisions, because one can always say that decisions need to be referred to the board. But it also means that there's probably a more dispassionate approach, which can be taken by the negotiator in order to guide management on decisions that will be taken. And then the last point is that if you reach a decision that really there is no option but to pay the ransom, or that paying the ransom will be easier than incurring the costs of doing a full recovery, then you need to make sure that, firstly, if you are insured, that your insurers are on board with that payment being made. Secondly, that all necessary sanctions and anti-money laundering checks have been done, and there is quite a comprehensive process which is dealt with by OFAC, which is the US Sanctions Office, for any kind of cybercrime ransom payment. And of course, you will probably know that most cyber ransoms are extorted in cryptocurrency and usually in Bitcoin. So it's important to make sure that there is some level of due diligence done on the target crypto wallets to make sure that they aren't affiliated with any listed terrorist or other sanctioned organizations. And then lastly, if a payment is going to be made, it's important to understand that that takes time. It takes time to acquire crypto. It can take time to transfer it. And all of that is important in terms of managing expectations and understanding what the path to recovery for your business looks like. When I talk to our clients about cyber incidents, I'm almost always asked for war stories, and this is a good one. It's a case study of an incident that happened in the last 2 months in South Africa. And it would be useful just to walk through a couple of the features of that incident because it shows how cybercrime is evolving and how what is happening on the ground in South Africa is completely consistent with the kind of research that Edison showed you earlier. So this was an attack on a large manufacturing business with operations in various different African countries. A large amount of sensitive data was stolen, approximately 50 gigabytes, and the recent backups were also encrypted, which meant that there was a severe impact on the business because not only was its Active Directory impacted by the stolen data, but its backups were encrypted, so it didn't have an obvious path to recovery. There was a significant ransom demand of around 13 million US dollars in Bitcoin. And the question was then what to do. Do we negotiate? Do we try and buy time? How do we kind of even begin to approach this problem? The company took its main systems offline, and because it's a manufacturing business, they had to ensure that they could switch over to manual processing in factories and similar facilities. Unfortunately, most of the machines that actually did the manufacturing were not internet connected, so they could continue to operate, and then they used good old pen and paper to keep track of production and invoicing. In the meantime, management took an early decision that in principle they would not pay ransom. And that was a very important kind of barometer for us because it enabled us in how we coordinated the response to work within the parameter that there would not be a decision to pay ransom at any point, but that we could look to negotiate to try and buy time, to see if the company could reach into older backups to restore some of the impacted data, and also to get ahead of the public narrative because rumors were starting to swirl in the market. It became known that there had been a cyber incident, and the company was then able to take a decision to put out a proactive announcement around what had happened, which also took some of the power away from the threat actors. And what was really good about how this negotiation developed is that because the company had taken that decision and because the board was very clear about the direction that it wanted to take, it kind of depowered the leverage that the threat actors had. So by putting out that proactive communication, by owning the fact that the company was a victim of cybercrime and particularly of a ransomware attack, it meant that the threat of exposing the data reduced in severity as the negotiations developed. And so negotiations managed to continue at a kind of controlled pace over a period of about 10 days. The board continued to work through all of these variables as their IT and forensic investigation developed. And once they had a pretty clear understanding of the data set that was impacted and the kind of customers who were affected, the board took a decision to terminate negotiations. The threat actors didn't take that lightly. This is the incident in which they then attempted direct threats, and the CFO was contacted telephonically by an individual who we suspect was Russian or Eastern European, who made personal threats against the board member and went so far as to say to him that he knew where his children went to school. So this illustrates how threat actor extortion tactics are evolving. A year or two ago, we would never have seen a threat of that kind of personal nature. But what happened here is that once the threat actors had realized that the company wasn't serious about paying them, they tried to escalate the threats in a different way. So it was a difficult situation. The individual in question was provided with personal protection for a while, but ultimately the decision not to pay the ransom proved correct because they were able to recover from all the backups. There was a loss of about 3 weeks worth of operating data, but it was ultimately a positive story in that the cyber criminals did not get paid and the company has been able to recover substantially. There's a really good question I see from Nadia in the chat, which is whether with an OFAC check, an actual clearance certificate is provided. An OFAC check is part of the sanctions checking process that is undertaken. And Nadia, what is typically done there is that the outsourced specialist who's conducting the investigation and the due diligence on the crypto wallet that is provided will have to work through a checklist which OFAC considers to be satisfactory. They will need to provide confirmation that they have checked the target wallet, the crypto wallet to which the funds will be sent. They will run name checks if the group is known, like Black Cat or AlphaVM, which Edison mentioned earlier, to check that they don't appear on any sanctions lists. And there are a few other boxes that need to be ticked. That service provider will then produce a report to say that they've done that due diligence to the best of their ability. And provided that report is satisfactorily completed, that will generally satisfy the OFAC requirement. So that's a kind of service provider side measure. One doesn't ever get a certificate from the OFAC itself. But if it does ask questions and if your company has any US exposure, it's critical to follow those steps. We've talked about a lot of the difficult, the hard stuff that affects these kind of incidents, but I wanted to share with you some of the light at the end of the tunnel in terms of where the fight against ransomware is going on a global basis. The good news is that multinational law enforcement agencies are cooperating to an extent that we have never seen before in fighting back against ransomware syndicates. In February of this year, there was a significant blow struck against the Lockbit ransomware group when it was disrupted by the seizure of its servers and decryption keys, and that was part of something called Operation Kronos, which was coordinated between the UK's National Cybersecurity Agency and the FBI. There is a really interesting fight going on in the background with counter-hacking that is going on, with infiltration of ransomware groups, and we can only hope that as law enforcement agencies in South Africa start to participate in these efforts, that we will see those bearing fruit as well. What's really interesting about getting behind the scenes of these ransomware groups is that the law enforcement agencies have been able to gather some crucial intelligence which shows how these groups operate. The first is that ransomware as a service groups use vast networks of affiliates. They basically sell licensed ransomware software, which is then used by anyone to go and carry out attacks with very little control. So there's not a lot of consistency in how the groups operate, and there's a lot of freedom given to their affiliates in the way in which they can extort their victims. The second is that for companies that had paid ransoms against a promise that the data that was stolen would be deleted, that turns out in most cases not to be true. So data which companies had been told had been deleted was in fact retained and was being mined by groups to carry out further attacks and identity theft. And there's actually a whole kind of hierarchy, a feeding chain of cybercrime that uses stolen data to carry out further incidents. And all of that is actively traded on the dark web. The third is that many threat actors don't offer effective decryption tools. So if data is stolen and encrypted, it's almost never a straightforward question of getting it back or decrypting it. It's not like flicking a switch and the lights come back on. Often, once it's decrypted, data files will be put back together in a jumbled kind of way. There may be missing chunks from data sets, but the decryption tools don't always work in the way that is promised by these cybercrime groups. And lastly, it just goes to show that you cannot trust criminals and there is no honor amongst thieves. It's quite clear from all of these findings that these groups operate for profit. They don't make good on their undertakings to victims, and they tend to simply complete one incident and then they will move on to the next. It is a volume business. So that the fight goes on, and we hope to see some further breakthroughs in coming months, but it's a very, very interesting space, and we encourage you to keep an eye on that. I'm going to hand back to Edison, who's going to give you a couple of tips around strengthening your cybersecurity posture, and then we'll wrap up just with telling you about what the full workshop entails that we're offering, and we'll take some more questions at the end. Thanks, Edison.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. And if you do have any questions, please fire them through. we do have a couple more minutes that we can take a couple, either pop them in on a chat, or once we're done, if we have a bit of time, you can just lift your hand up and then we can just take it from there. So in my Friday action night voice that I had earlier on, I did mention a couple of things that you could do to protect your organization, but I decided, you know what, there's about a couple of things that you can take away from this session that you can start doing in your organization right now. These are sort of like the quick wins, right? User security training, that has become a key one. As mentioned, the threat vector where attackers normally come in is through the user. It's called social engineering, where they try to trick users to click unsolicited emails, which essentially now installs part of a ransomware into the environment, which now starts off the chain reaction, and next thing you get your data encrypted. So if you don't have a program where you train your users, I think that's going to be a first port of call. There are many programs out there that involved an element of gamification, so it makes it a bit more exciting for users, so they don't just sit there and just watch videos, which they forget a lot of the times. So that's going to be the first port of call, right? Zero trust is a concept where essentially you got to look at how you've actually designed your entire architecture. A lot of people are trying to move into the cloud, moving from legacy systems. You need to think of how you actually architect your environment to make sure that you reduce the blowback should the attackers actually get into your environment. There are a number of things that actually form part of a zero trust strategy, such as network segmentation and ability to sort of authenticate at every single chance that you get. But you can work with organizations such as ours that can actually help you get on this your zero trust journey, because it is a journey. There is no zero trust product that you can buy, off the shelf and then use zero trust compliant. That's not how it works. So there's another part you can embark on. And there's a concept about minimum effective tool set where you need to sit down and actually see what you require in your environment for you to be effective. A lot of times people chase the best of breed technologies, and new technology comes out and people try to buy it. And that doesn't necessarily work, because we've seen organizations with big budgets and don't necessarily become more secure. And the last but not least part, third-party risk. That is a big deal. That is a big deal, because on top of the managed services provider that I mentioned earlier on, we're seeing a lot of the partners that you deal with in your environment, they are about of a big risk to your environment, because there's a lot of communication that takes place between, there's an element of trust a lot of time with third parties. And if you don't have a program that sort of forces your partners to have a bit of a minimum level of security to ensure that your ecosystem is protected, you need to have that in place. It's something you need to start thinking about at a business decision maker level and say, how are we checking that our third parties are secure? It's one thing for you to secure your environment, but your ecosystem has to be secure. So I think those are the ones I'll end off on those for now, because there's a lot more that you could do. But for now, we're keeping this very high level, things for you to start thinking about, things for you to start going back into your organization and speaking to your IT team or your own internal security team, if you have it, and ask them, what are we doing regarding these? So, Chris, do we have just a minute or two?
We do, Edison. So if there are any other questions which people would like to put through, please just pop those through in the chat. Thought it would be useful just to talk about a couple of the responses that we received to the poll questions. The first question was, do you provide ransomware and cybercrime training to your decision makers and board members regarding cybersecurity incidents? And we can see a vast majority of you have responded yes. So what's really encouraging is that there is obviously a proactive approach being taken to this kind of training, and that's precisely why we've developed this workshop.
If I can jump in there, Chris, I think maybe it wasn't clear in the question, but the training that is mentioned in the poll is different than the user security awareness training that people normally have, where you get taught how to avoid phishing and how to, not fall for social engineering. That's a different training than the one that was actually mentioned on the poll, where is the type of stuff that we do in this workshop, where it's multifaceted, where you're looking obviously at the technical response, the legal response, the communication aspect, that sort of thing. So I don't know if is that how people also understood the question, but yeah, back to you, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Edison. I think that's a good point, because what we're talking about is kind of experience-based training to equip board members and senior decision makers around how to deal with these incidents. And a couple of themes that we've unpacked in today's session are dealt with in much greater detail in the workshop. The second question of interest was whether you feel confident in your organization's ability to recover from a ransomware attack. And I'm curious to see that there's a pretty bullish response to this one, with also a majority of respondents saying that they are confident in their organization's ability to recover. I suppose recovery takes many forms, but I can tell you from our experience, it takes a long time to get fully back to business. And it often takes a lot of understanding from customers and affected parties, and particularly in dealing with the regulator, to make sure that there are no unexpected surprises, and to make sure that one is doing the right things in terms of POPI and the law. So it's interesting and pleasing to read that response, and I hope that it's true for most of your organizations. You will see on the slide on your page that there is a QR code. If you follow that QR code, it's not going to take you to a phishing or a ransomware link. It's not going to download any malware on your machines. That is the link to the workshop, which provides you with more details about what we've developed with CYBER1 Solutions. We think that this is a first for South Africa, where we have legal and technical specialists coming together to share insights about the real state of cybercrime and the kind of practical tools that are needed to fight it within companies. And we're really excited to roll this workshop out for the benefit of those in the market. Even if you're not a decision maker in one of those roles, we find that it really helps to sensitize important stakeholders within a business to what IT teams go through in dealing with cyber crises, and understanding the kind of interface that needs to take place between all of those role players who we spoke about earlier. And lastly, I'm going to be sharing a link in the chat with you to download a full copy of Clyde & Co.'s Under the Hood white paper. That's the source of many of the stats and charts that you saw on Edison's slide earlier. But it provides a fascinating insight into the state of cybercrime in 2024. And if you would like to receive a full copy of that report, please just go through to that link. Again, it's not a trick, and you're welcome to get that for free from our colleagues in Australia. So we'll pop that through. We don't have any other questions that have come through on the chat, as far as I can see. So I think we will wrap it up there. But I'd just like to hand back to Edison and the CYBER1 Solutions team, and thank you very much for your time and participation today.
Thank you so much, Chris. I see a couple of people are sending clapping hands there. Thank you guys for spending this time with us this morning. We really appreciate it. As mentioned, please follow the link. There's more information around the workshop, and so that they can actually you get sort of a breakdown in terms of what is entailed in it. And thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.